We're on page Kufit Ches. Today's sheet is really very simple. It's straight up. I told you yesterday, and I'm repeating it again today. These two Perakim, Ches and Tes, go together. They're a package. And the Tzemach Tzedek's Ikir is Perek Tes. Perek Ches is a setup, it's a segue to Perek Tes. How did Perek Ches begin? Perek Ches begins with V'hine b'masha kasavna, right? When we spoke in the earlier Perek, or Perakim, about the interface between Eila v'Leila Midesav and the idea of Yedim b'chavim b'shem, we understand the Mitzvas Hatefilla. And I have to tell you, yesterday in the morning, I learned through the Mitzvas Hatefilla. You just see how Rishonim write. It's very, very clear. It's very concise. If an Achen wrote that tshuva, it's 4 tshuvas. It's 10 pages. It's so bekit, it's so klar. There's no extra words. And you know what? If you know the stuff, even basically, there's no missing word. It's not like you have to guess. It's written, clear, b'lei chaser or b'lei yeser. Exactly what you need is there in the tshuva. And this, like I said to you, yesterday I wrote notes on the sheet. I put it up online. I wrote, there's a question, there's 2 questions, but only 1 answer. The first question was, pardon me, how could we mechavim b'shem l'cheded is more than one eibishter? I'm sorry. That question has an answer. That question has answer. And of course the answer is the Eila v'Leila Mideisa, but not chas v'sholem, davening to the Sfiris. We're davening to the eibishter. Not then, we're davening to the eibishter that he should be mashpiyah to us through the Sfiris. And then the second question was, even now that we answered and explained that there's no shaila, there's no problem with Yedim L'chavim B'Shem, because chas v'shalom to say that you're davening to the Midas, you're davening to the Eibishter, you're simply asking him that he should be mashpiyah to you through the Midas. It becomes a second question. So there's no shaila in halacha, there's no shaila of achtas. But why bother? Why get into trouble, right? Why do you have to make it complicated? What is wrong with making it simple? Huh? Ani mispale leda ze'atinik. I talk to Eibishter like a child. I'm a smart guy. It was written by a Rishon. Yeah, what was his name? The Tzemach Tzedek doesn't bring his name, but we have it in the tshuva. I put the tshuva up. Reb Shimshon Mikinun, huh?
Dan Yosef?
No. Dan Yosef the answer to the question. But Reb Shimshon Mikinun was asking the question. Afilu, if you're allowed to be mechavim b'shem, because it's not hepech achtos, but why not talk to the Eibishter like a child? This second question doesn't have an answer in the tshuva. This second question the Rivash leaves as a question, and that's how the tshuva ends. In other words, what the Rivash is doing, you have to understand, you're talking about an age where nobody knew anything about Kabbalah. And in this tshuva, the Rivash is explaining a little bit what Sfiris are, a little bit what Malachim are, a little bit what the sheet of the Mukobalim are. But he's not really paskening, he's not really saying what's right and what's wrong. He's simply presenting to a certain Yid who had Fashidin Kashes where the legitimacy of Kabbalah is. And like I said, he even goes through a list of Svarim. He says, these Svarim are good. But the Sefer that you quoted, not so good. It's fascinating. Very bekitzer. But the Rivash is not saying you should do this or you should do this. The Rivash is simply saying this is not apokursis, and there are people who say don't do it anyway. That's all he does. Is the Yid who asked him the question was not asking whether he should be mechaven. The Yid was basically asking him, tell me what you know about Chochmas HaKabbalah and the Vedas Hashem al Derech HaKabbalah. And the Rivash is answering the question really, exact. So again, I want to repeat myself. In this tshuva, there's 2 kashas and 1 teret. The first kasha is, how are you allowed to do it? And for this he answers that you're mispalel to the Eibishter, but it's al derech mashal, asking a king to send you to the Seichen, or to the Sara Oifer, or to the Sara Mashkin, or to the Shefet. And the second question, that even if you're allowed to be mechavim b'shem, why should I not be a child? This question remains unanswered, and this is the question which the Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, is going to answer this question in Perek Tes. There is a however, there's a but. And I'll tell you what the but is. We had, in the end of perek Beis, Azhara from the Baal Shem Tov. I remember the first time I learned this. I mean, I was so little, I didn't even understand that it's a big deal. I learned Dach Mitzvah Hatefilla. I learned Sheish. I remember my Malama teaching us, and I hate to admit it, I have a feeling my teacher didn't understand much more than we did. But we didn't know what was flying. It says in the end of perek Beis, the Baal Shem Tov says don't learn Kabbalah. Why? If a person does not have the sufficient ability to strip away the gashmias, the mushal from the nimshal, he becomes very grub himself through this limud. And of course, what's worse, he makes the Eibishter begushim. When he creates images because of the poverty of his own das, is barach to the Eibishter. And then it continues. It's not the pshat, says the Baal Shem Tov, that Kabbalah isn't true. It's emes. But the Baal Shem Tov says don't do it because you're not going to understand it correctly. So we have a azhara from the Baal Shem Tov that learning Kabbalah is a sakona, not because it's not emes, but because you have to understand the mishalim with sufficient hafshata. You have to be mafshad the mishalim and gashmias. So there seems to be a pattern. I think what I'm about to say is true. I didn't research this. This is not my field. I'm not a researcher. I try to learn and teach. People who sit, so I mentioned was lernen Teire. So I mentioned was lernen die Lerner. People write books about the books. They're not really understanding what the writers are writing. They're finding patterns, all kinds of things. It's not my thing. But it seems to me that the further back in Kabbalah you go, the more Megushim the Mishalim are. If you go back to the Kabbalah from the Chazal, like from the Gemara and from the Midrashim, and I think you could say the same about the Zohar, the Mishalim are very Gashmiistic. As you get later and later in the world of the Mekubalim, the Pardes, the Arizal, and certainly in Hasidus, the Mishalim become very edel. Or edeler. There's no such thing as very edel. Edeler. And I think the reason is because the Mekubalim Rishonim didn't think we're that stupid. When the Mekubalim Rishonim gave a mashal, they understood that we have seichel. If a person with seichel learns a mashal, he'll understand himself the adinus of the nimshal, the edelkeit of the nimshal. But as time passed and people became less odin, less edel, the mishalim of the Rishonim became a problem. And here's a classic example. This is a mashal from Arishan. It's a mashal from Arishan. And this mashal from Arishan opens up a huge question. And that Tzemach Tzedek digresses. Tzemach Tzedek quotes the Tshuvas HaRivosh. He brings the words of the Mekubal Don Yosef Zal. And he says, I have to tell you what he means. The reason that Tzemach Tzedek feels obligated to tell us what the Mekubal Don Yosef means is because the Tzemach Tzedek is afraid we're going to misunderstand. It's not the pshat that the Mekubal meant what we'll understand Beif Mashalak Shoma. It's the pshat, forgive me for being blunt, he never thought we could be that stupid. But the Tzemach Tzedek says, I must tell you what he meant. Again, I want to repeat what I said. It seems to me, I don't know this for sure, and I never researched this thoroughly, but from what they call anecdotal, from the experiences that I have, the further back in Teiras HaKabbalah you go, the less precise the Mishalim are. The more Megushim, the more the Mishalim sound like, a man going to a man and having a party and getting up and going to sleep. The edelkeit of the Mishalim increases as you go deeper and deeper, later, closer to us. In Chassidus, the Mishalim are much edeler. And the Chas v'Shalom, that the Rishonim couldn't come up with edel and Mishalim. The Rishonim never thought there was a need to bavorn it. And this is why the Tzemach Tzedek says, I want to tell you something. Yeah? What's the tshuva of the Rivosh say? What does Don Yosef HaMekubal Zal say? The Mekubal Don Yosef Zal says that davening to the Eibishter and being mechaven to the Sfiris is al derech moshel, coming to a king. And you're coming to a king, if you want judgment from the king, you ask the king to send you to the judge. Or you ask the king to tell the judge to judge you. If you want an adava, you come to the king and say, send me to the Seichen. The Seichen means the Minister of Finance, who's involved in business. If you want wine, you say to the king, send it to the Saramashkim. And if you want bread, you say to the king, send it to the Sarayefim. What's wrong with this mashal? This mashal is people. People have free will. If the king is sending you to the shofet, that's shituf. Why? The king has free will. You somehow have free will. And the shofet has free will. Am I going to listen to the king? Am I not going to listen to the king? Am I going to pass what the king wants? Now, of course, shituf believes that you listen to the Eibishter, but shituf believes in Bechira, right? Shituf is mutter for goyim. A goy is allowed to believe in shituf. What does shituf mean? Hashem has helpers who have free will. That's the key to shituf. Hashem has helpers who have free will, but they do what he says. But for a Yid, shituf is avodah zarah. A Yid is not allowed to believe that Hashem has helpers who have free will. A Yid has to believe that the so-called helpers of the Eibishter are a hammer. Hammers never built anything, and hammers never destroyed anything. People do. But the mashal that the Revash brings, that Don Yosef brings, is not a mashal from a hammer. It's a mashal from people. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, and I'm reading inside, V'hinei betchila, 5 lines into Kuf Yud Ches. It's really very straight up. It's a whole amid, 2/3 of a page, where the Tzemach Tzedek is Pashut saying, when you read a mashal from a Rishon, how do you say it in Yeshivish? Forgive me, Zainish Kaferd. Right? From a Lashon from Rebbe Marash. And in front of the Yeshivas, I told this to you once before, that in the lifetime of the Rebbe Marash, there was a Yid. Who was, in the Yeshivas doesn't say who he was. He was a very big Talmid Chacham, a very big Gaon. And he dabbled in Kabbalah upon him. But apparently he had no Ruchniyatik Chush. He didn't have a feel for it. So the Rebbe Marash commented about this man, and he was a big, famous person. Quote, a Ferd, a Pashten, weiß gar von kein Himmel nicht. Ad kan l'shen HaKadosh. He's a Ferd, he's a Pashten, he's a simplifier, he has no concept of a sky. Now, you know what a Ferd is, right? A Ferd is a horse. But the Rebbe Paltiel that in Hebrew, one of the words for Ferd is pered. You know what pered is? Pshat, Remez, Drush. I taught you something, huh? Fed is pshat, rem is drush, and I'll tell you a piece of Lubavitcher politics. The years memhei, memvav, memzayin, I wasn't here. Were years of gefelach machlekes. The last years were so full of machlekes. It was sad. It was scary. And one of the things that people were saying is everyone was accusing the other of not being makusher, of being a nifrid. So the Rebbe Pashut by Fabrengen spoke about nifrid. Reuven accuses Shimon of being a nifrid, and Shimon accuses Reuven of being a nifrid, and Reuven and Shimon are running around to Levi and Yehudi and Sachar and Shmuel and say, hate him! Why, he's a nifrid! So the Rebbe spoke about the word nifrid, and he said the shaders of the word nifrid is the word pered, and that's oizgeteicht, pshat rem is drush. What's a ferd? Pshat rem, in Yiddish ferd is a horse. But in Hebrew, ferd is pered, pei reish dal pshat. If you have pshat, rem is drush, no seid, you're a ferd, a pashten, face gofik and himmelish. And I think that that's what the Rebbe Marash meant. He didn't mean a horse, that eats hay. He meant a ferd. There's no chush in ruchni, there's no chush inside. So the Tzemach Tzedek says, Lo hoitze mi liban shal aferdim. So that a ferd, a pshat rem is drushnik. Was no chush inside, should not misunderstand. So he says like this. I want to tell you what Don Yosef HaMekubal Zal meant. V'hine, I'm reading inside. B'tchila tzorich levayik tzas. You have to first explain a little bit. Divrei HaMekubal now, the words of the Mekubal. Why? Shalayachshev hama'ayin. I'm afraid that you and I, who read Divrei HaRishon, Divrei HaRivash, who's quoting a Yid who is a Makubal and a Anav and a Kadeh, a Yeshish Alamailis. Shahamosho. I can't hear you.
Where are you reading from?
Page Kuf Yud Ches, 6 lines from the top of the page. I'm reading inside. Kuf Yud Ches, 6 lines out of the page. Shahamoshol Demelinim Shal Mamish. That the Moshel that the Makubal Don Yosef Zal brings is exactly the same as the Nimshal. Shalaham Shech Hashefa Beis Esfira B'chulu. That when you're asking the Eibishter Kvayochel, That the Eibush should bring a shefa to this Sfira, it's Kamesha Omar, b'moshel, like it's in the Moshel, b'pashtos, Shemavakesh mehamelech, sheyitav el ha-seichen, v'chula, you're asking the king to speak to the Eitzah. Because that's classic Shituf. If the Sfiras have free will, and you're speaking to the Eibush, that he should tell us Sfira, to kach v'kach, that's heipach achtas. And again, for a goy it's mutter, but for you it's also. The Rebbe brings in the Maimon Bas Lagan Tafshin Yimur with a whole bunch of Manamakhemis, but there's different shittas about it. B'nei ne'ech le'nitz tav ala shituf. But for you, that's of it is other. So the marshal is scary. So Tzemach Tzedek is saying the marshal isn't scary. You're a fed. You're a fed, a pashtan, veis gorfek and himmelnish. Reb Don Yosef HaMakubal never thought that you would have that much pashtanut in your thinking that you would have this kash. Tzemach Tzedek says, but I'm afraid that you do, because it's how many years? Between the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rivosh, it's about 500 years. So Tzemach Tzedek says, I want to make sure we don't make no mistakes. So he says, Lefi shalamato b'moshel ha-seichin ha-shefet. When you're talking down here in the moshel, seichin means the Sad HaEitzah, the Minister of Finance. And shefet means the Attorney General, the Minister of Law. And they're separate people. And of course you want to add, with their own free will. They're not the king. Who had done the judges. The king isn't judging, the judge is judging. The Minister of Finance, he gives you the, what do they call it in America today? The stimulus. I know about stimulus because I got stimulus, and it's good. It worked for a little bit. The king. The king's only giving instructions. Just that's taka what Don Yosef said. But that's not what he meant. And I want to explain to you clearly that to use the Lashon of the Baal Shem Tov in Sof Perek Beis, no ferdius, no pashtanut, and no eves gorfik in himmelish. Says the Rebbe, it's not the way it is by the Eibishter. Because when you're talking in the Nim Shalabar Alakus and Svidus, it's the Eibishter himself. Who habayre, he's the creator. Who hadayin, he's the judge. And he brings us a state in the Mishnah, say Pedal Pirkei Avos. V'afapi shadin nimshach aydei Sfiras Hagvura, says the Rebbe. It's emes that the Eibishter Kvayochel judges using Sfiras Hagvura. She'ene habayre is barach atzmi is barach the Eibishter himself. Parenthesis afapi shilakus kanal, even though the midas nesiras are lakus. And again, in this parenthesis, you have the two shitas of the Pardes and the Baal Shem Tov, which I talked about in earlier shiurim, I'm not repeating them. Says the Rebbe, you should know that in the Nimshal Mahila, the Eibush is not sending you to a judge. The Eibush is judging. The Eibush is not sending you to a bank. The Eibush is the bank. The Eibush is not sending you to a Sara Eifim or Sara Mashkim. The Eibush is the Sara Eifim or Mashkim. Not of a den. Mikomokim einam shacha me'asfira atzmo. But the Eibush, what comes to us from Gvura, or from Chesed, or from Teferes, or from Netzach, and from Heid, is not from the Sfira itself. El Ma'abedi is brought from the Eibush, Shadon Ayedei Sfira Hanal, who judges through this Sfira. And therefore it comes out, who Hadayan, he is the judge, B'chulu. V'chein hu Hanesan Hamatan, he's the one giving the gift, Ayedei Sfira Sachesed. And the Tzemach Tzedek says, V'loi kemoisha b'moshel. It's not the way it's written in the Moshel, that Hasechem ba'atzmei neisen, that the Sara Eitzet has a key, he opens up a vault, he takes out money and he gives it to you. V'lei HaMelech, not the king. So it says, don't for a moment think that that's what this Don Makubal, Don Yosef Zal meant. He never meant that. He says it. It never crossed Don Yosef's mind that you would be so simplistic. But the Tzemach Tzedek says that was written 500 years ago. Today, Daf Mendos Bavorene, and this is a concern. So I'm going to waste the whole perek to explain to you Mamish Aleph Beis. We're going to keep on reading. Ve'ein leimar, you should not say the imkain, if that's the case, that the king is the one judging versus the seichin or the shefet. Like us, the shapem mashakosov, it's hard to understand what it says in the mashal. If you have an argument with another person, it sounds clearly. You're coming to the king and you're asking him, tell the judge to judge me. Loishi Yitzav ala Seichen, as opposed to commanding the Seichen. Seichen means the one in charge of finance. Kitisha Elosei Betos could the requested be a mistake. And if we're saying now that you're talking to the king, and the king is himself going to be the judge, and the king himself going to be the Menadvan, he's doing it to the Sfira, so how does that mashal hold true? Dani Chaba mashal. So the Tzemach Tzedek says you don't understand. The mashal is describing a worldly scene. In a worldly scene, the Seichen is a Metzias B'fnei Atzmei, and the Shofet is a Metzias B'fnei Atzmei, and the Sarah Oifim is a Metzias B'fnei Atzmei, and the Sarah Mashkim is a Metzias B'fnei Atzmei. But it's only the way it is in the mashal. And you have to have a little seichel, not a lot, a little seichel. Lahafshit hadvarim megash miyusam when it comes to the nimshal. Let's read it. Bim mashal, in the physical world, how is it? Shayeshev ala mishpat v'aseichen, that a judge or a finance minister, heim shnei anaf nefradim. First of all, they're separate from the king. And second of all, they're separate from one another. And you should know these two separatenesses are connected. You should know this is a higoyin, and there's a remes for it in Tanya Perek, Sharichat Demona Perek Zayin. And that is that there's two questions of Achtos and Pirat. One question is, are the Sfiras one with the Eibishter, or are they separate from the Eibishter? And the second question is, are the Sfiras separate from one another? And Hoba Talya, if you say that the Sfiras are not separate from the Eibishter, the Chaykim say, Malachama Nivdal. But the Mukabalim say that the Sfiras are Nitias, right? If you say that the Sfiras are not separate from the Eibishter, then you have what's called Hiskalalus. They're not separate from one another either. But in the mashal, they sound like two different people. Ushneya meinim hamelach, and neither of them are the king. So you get 2 points here. Point A: the shofet and the seichen are two different fellows with two different departments with their own free will, and they don't grapple with each other. Point 2: they're separate from the king. So in the mashal, you got two basic philosophical ideas of pirud: separation from one another and separation from the king. It's impossible for the person whose job it is to be a judge, to give tzedakah v'chulu. Therefore, if you would come to the king and say to the king, tell the judge to give me money, it's not going to happen. It's a mistake. Says the Rebbe Mashen, but when you're talking about the Eibishter, it's different. It's of course much edelin. How? Shabede is barach the Eibishter himself, who atzmei hayeshev ala mishpat. He's not telling Midas Hadin to judge you. He's judging you through Midas Hadin. By the Eibishter going into Sfiras HaGvura. And at the same time, who atzmei haseichen is also the Sarha Oitzer. That means the treasury minister. Hanesin matan aide achased. It doesn't give a matana through chesed. The question is, how is it a proper marshal? Even if the person asks a matana from the king. If we're talking about Melech, Malchi Hamlachim, the Eibishter himself ain't saved Baruch Hu. She had Sava ala Shefet B'chol, that he should tell the judge. It's not a mistake. Heich Yikore Zeh Shaila Betos. How was that a mistake? Sharehu Yizbarach Hu HaShefet. The Eibishter is the judge. V'hu Atzmei Aneisen Matan. He's also the one giving the matones v'cholu. So Mikol Mokim Tziazei Tziazei. In any case, Kivan Shahabede Yizbarach, since the Eibishter is Darkei Lashpiha Matna Idei Slapshusa B'Chesed. Okay, let me pause before the Mikol Mokim. I'm going to stop a second. So the Tzemach Tzedek says this is where the mistake is. The mistake is in two parts. Number one, in the mashal, the king is separate from the people who are doing you the favor. And number two, in the mashal, the people who are doing you the favors are separate from each other. So focus on the second part, not on the first part. In the mashal, the king tells the shofet to judge. He tells the seichen to give money. If you tell the judge to give money, he doesn't have. He just doesn't have. If you tell the person with money to do judgment, he's not equipped for this. But if in the nimshal the Eibush is doing it all, why is that wrong? So the Tzemach Tzedek says, when you read the mashal leads to a misunderstanding. So the Tzemach Tzedek answers. Here's the answer. You're right, the mashal is Megushim. And again, I want to say this very clearly. It's not the pshat the mashal is Megushim because the Rishonim had a problem in Avon of Kabbalah. The pshat is the mashal.
1 minute.
Kriyashman
1 minute.
Kriyashman 1 minute, Yashakir. It's not the pshat that the mashal is Megushim. It's the pshat that the Rishonim thought we'll understand by ourselves. But the Tzemach Tzedek talks it out. Let's read. Mikol Mokem, I'm 12 lines from the end of the paragraph, first word on the line. Nevertheless, Kivan Shabedi is Barach. Since the Eibishter, Darke Lashpi, Ahamat, on the way the Eibishter gives him matonis. It's Ayadei Slapshu Sibachas, by going into Sfiras HaChesed. V'lai Ayadei Slapshu Sibachvura, not going through Sfiras HaGevura. Im Kain, therefore, the Moshel is Haka correct. Kishishay Yel Mimenu Hamatam, when you come to the Eibishter, and you ask him for a maton. Lashpi Alay. The Eibishter Yashpa. But Ayadei Slapshu Sibachvura, by the Eibishter going to Midas HaGevura, who tossed, it's a mistake. It's not the same mistake as it is in the Moshel. Why? Because in the Moshel, you come to the king, and you say, tells the judge, give you money, the judge doesn't have any money. In the Nimshal, it's not the pshat, you're telling the Eibush to tell the judge to give you money, you're asking the Eibush for money. But you're asking the Eibush for money as he's slapshus midas hagvura. If the Eibush has money, no, but then it's the wrong midah. Says the Rebbe, nevertheless, that's the havona. I'm reading it inside. V'hei nemes, it's taket true. Kabedi is barach at the Eibush, can do whatever he wants. Yuchal ashpia chesed gam kan adei hagvura. If he wanted, you come to the Eibishter and you call him a likim, which is midas hagvura, and you ask him for chesed. If he wants, he gives. Why? Because there's taka different between the mashal of the king and the nimshal of the Eibishter. Because the mashal of the king, you're talking about separate people. A, they're separate from the king. B, they're separate from one another. And in the nimshal, you're talking about the king. The king is doing it himself, and the different spheres are not different creations. They're different kvayachal levushim, which the Eibishter is mislabish. Nevertheless, each media includes all the others. This is a whole of these words. Is mentioned in the beginning of Shari Yichud Ve'emunah, where it says Elam Chesed Yibona. I just want to tell this to you because I think it's a point in Shari Yichud which people miss. It says in Pasuk Elam Chesed Yibona. Hashem created the world with Chesed, and there's a lot of taich in this pasuk. The Alter Rebbe says Elam Chesed Yibona means the Eibishter did Gevura with Chesed. Olam Lashon Helam is Gevura. Chesed Yibona was the kindness of the Eibishter. The beginning of Shari Yichud of Emunah perek Vov. Look inside after like 10 lines into the page. Olam Gevura Chesed Yibona through Chesed. Why? Because the Eibishter reveals too much light, he'll destroy us. Because of the Eibishter would reveal too much light, he will destroy us. The hiding is a kindness. So the Alter Rebbe says, I don't understand. If the Eibush is giving us chesed, he's giving us chesed. If the Eibush is giving us gvura, he's giving us gvura. How do you have chesed and gvura together? And the answer is because we're talking about sfiris. And when you're talking about sfiris, there's two things. Number one, the sfiras are one with him. And therefore, number two, the sfiras are one with each other. And since the sfiras are one with each other, there is gvura and chesed, and there's chesed and gvura. That's what these few words mean. In Gevura you have chesed also. Says the Rebbe, but the way the Eibishter created Seder Ishtalshlos, or in the Lashon Harav, V'Seder Ishtalshlos Shel Tzechois, and L'Shlazeh Tzaros Chuzgal. The idea that you should get a chesed from the Eibishter Kvayachal, as he's bislapchus and midas hagavura, because this iskalos requires a great schus lahapach midas hadin lerachmim to transform din into rachamim. Kibemidas hadin, when the Eibishter Kvayachal is relating to the world through midas hadin, darke ledaktek. This is what I always tell you. A judge is not mean and bad. A judge is not critical. A judge is not punitive. A judge is not vengeful. A judge is simply saying the truth. How do they say it in English? The truth hurts. Nobody wants the truth exposed, because when you expose the truth, you see dakosara. So Gvura is not bad. He's a medaktik. What happens if you're medaktik? So it says weiter. If you're going to start judging, the Shamayim has chesreines. Everybody has chesreines. So true, the Eibush is midas hagvura, could give chesed because of his scholars gvura and chesed, but that's not what midas hagvura is. So the Tzemach Tzedek is saying, you're right that the mashal is different than the nimshal. Because in the mashal, the king is separate from the people are separate from one another. And on the nimshal, the Eibush is doing it himself, and the same Eibush which is doing midas hagvura is doing the chesed. But it's still true, the mashal still makes the point that the way the Eibishter created Seder Ishtalshalos Kvayachal, when the Eibishter is mislabish and midas hagavura, he usually doesn't do kindness, he usually does diktuk. It says in the pasuk, Yamar Meisha, Moshe Rabbeinu fell to the ground, says the Gemara, Ma'aro, what did Moshe Rabbeinu see? Emes, I saw truth, chulu. And emes is the ultimate din, right? The truth hurts. Trust me. I don't have you have to trust me, just trust your own honesty. The truth hurts. Okay? Imlay ayedei schus gadol ratzon. Unless you have a very great schus. Mash'ein can adi midas hachesed, as opposed to when the Eibush is mislabish midas hachesed. That what? That no. Darke lehetiv l'royim v'latevim. Midas hachesed is kind to everybody, even to those who are sinners. V'chol. Stop. We just read, what is it, half a page, Anerech? Yeah? It's a simple half a page. It's a very easy read. All that Tzemach Tzedek is doing, to use a classic Lashon, is he's being mafshit, hadvarim megashmi yusam, and a mashal from Rishonim. And you find this a lot. When you look in the Kabbalah, that was written 700 years ago, they all give mishalim that sounds like Sfiras HaPeep. We don't use mishalim of Sfiras being people. We use midas, your chesed, your gevur in one person. Because the Rishonim never thought that we're so pei reish daled dik that we're going to misunderstand it. Tzemach Tzedek is afraid, so Tzemach Tzedek clarifies. So again, we just wasted time. I know I don't mean that, but it makes the point. We're learning a Tshuvas HaRishonim, in which there's 2 kashas and 1 teretz. We just finished the first kasha and teretz. The kasha was, how are you allowed to daven to the Eibishter and be bechaven the Sfiras, it's Hepach HaAchtus? And the teretz says, no, you're davening to the Eibishter. Now, then the Eibishter created a Hishtalshalus. The Eibishter was a nice guy. As I told you in the earlier shurim, he didn't expect every Yid, every day, to holding in the Madrega of Chana HaNeviah, where she davens with a Hishtapchas HaNefesh, right? And Ikshas Ruach, and Ve'esh Peches Nafshe Lifnei Havaya, and therefore, Lekei Yisrael Yitin Es Shelasich, we don't hold the Madrega. The Eibusha says you can daven pros, daven like a posher to mensch, and you can reach Atzmas Amuz. This is a kindness of the Eibishter. It's a kindness of the Eibishter. Yeah? But when you're davening to the Eibishter, being mechaven b'shem, with the kind that the Eibishter comes closer to us, you need the schus gadol, what's the lashon inside? The schus gadol v'atzom, that from midas hagvudish you get a chesed. So that's the first kasha, and that's the first teretz, but the Tzemach Tzedek says. But then the Tzemach Tzedek finishes the perek. The second question of the Rivash. And I want you to know that the second question of the Rivash is also not his. He's quoting Reb Shimshon Mikinun. He says his name twice. Yeah? Reb Shimshon Mikinun says, why do you need it? Why do you need it? Was fällt es dir aus? Yeah? Mi machne say son because zoltak is ein as emes. It may be true that there's such a thing as elav ve'leila midesa yedim lechavim b'shem. But why do you have to get involved? How they tell you spell stam, daven stam. The shem is barach that Eibush it's in the leimel the ilas to the Eibush himself mishul lamayla b'sam shusam b'tfilas adayin has above sfidas. For who yeda be'ezes you talk to the Eibush, he'll figure out how to bring it to you. Im sheyislabish le'sfidas hachesed lifi inyan bakashas le'sholzeh. The Tzemach Tzedek says, this is a good kasha. The second kasha of the Rivash is a very good kasha, and he doesn't answer it. He remains with a tzarachiyun. Zol zayin that Kabbalah is Teda, Zol zayin that Kabbalah is Emes, but mi machne say sonu b'kol zeh. Why do we need it? And the teretz is the next word. Eliyashav zeh tzarach lov and in hallow. We will do this after Kabbalah Sateda Mitzvah. Okay? Kabbalah, Satera, B'simcha. You know the schedule for tomorrow and for Sunday? Of Baruch?
Basically, according to the paper, no say that.
I understand, but the gave them mavada sein. Okay, Rabbi Blau, if you could hear us, if you could tell us the schedule, it would be very helpful. Okay, but Pashtus, there's no Fabringen tonight. If I'm in a funny mood, maybe I'll come up with something, but I doubt it. I'm just so tired. I'm not working so hard, it's disgusting. L'chayre, quarantine, arbeit me wenig hier. I'm working very hard. Okay, good morning, Yiddish Kinderlach. I'll see you.